Make sure this leader gets up on it. It was suggested by me, Joe, that we write a letter recalling events that we remembered about our grandparents, because we seem to have so little in the genealogy file in that direction. So rather than write it, I suggested it'd be a lot easier and quicker to tape it. So that is what we're in the process of doing. Gordon is here with me and Mary Jane, and we're going to pick brains all the way along from those who can remember anything about the particular grandparents that we're working with. The first ones are the Lindners, who lived out in Oregon, in Roseburg, Oregon. This is Gustav and Lena Lindner. The best that Gordon and I can remember is our initial trip to Oregon taking place in the summer of 1935. And this seems to agree as best we can tell with our various thoughts. We're going to go through just Oregon first and then go through Hayward to separate the two. On that initial trip, we left Great Falls and in a rainstorm going to Helena, and the mud on the road was unbelievable, and how Dad ever got that Model A through, I'll never know. In preparation for this trip, he had built a Shriver cloth container for all of our bedding to put on the top of the car, because we were going to stay at tourist courts where you had to provide your own bedding. Unfortunately, in waterproofing it, he laced the whole thing with linseed oil, which never dried, and as a result, all of the bedding all the way on the trip smelled of linseed oil. Upon arriving at the folks' home in Roseburg, Oregon, I remember going down to the house from the main road, and when we stopped and got out, Granddad met us, and here's Granddad in tennis shoes, wearing a beard, and he said, come on in, make yourself comfortable, take your shoes off.
One of the things I remember about the trips we took, whether we went east or west, was Mother always packed lunch to go along on the trip. We were supposed to wait to eat at lunchtime, which never happened because we were eating it probably by the time we got out of the city limits of Great Falls. But one of her specialties that we liked was onion sandwiches. Sandwiches made with little early onions, not the big round ones, but the little onions chopped up in little pieces, and put them in sandwiches. Nothing else in it but bread, butter, and onion sandwiches. And we enjoyed those. I can remember that, whether we went one direction or the other. And the trip out there in that Model A, it was dusty roads, or it was muddy roads, it was flat tires. How we made that trip all the way out there in 1935 and back, it was a project in itself those days. But I remember Dad made a point to take us to places that we would remember, like Umatilla, Oregon, and the melons that we always bought, watermelons and cantaloupe right there. And then on to the Dells, Oregon. And I don't remember whether it was that trip or whether we made the Columbia River Gorge trip in the both times, that one and the later trip. But that was a memorable trip, and every time we're out that way, we'd go through that Columbia River Gorge again, and it brings back so many memories of some of those falls that were along the way there.
I'm going to add a little bit more to what Gordon said about the trip out. because when he mentioned the dust, there was road construction out of Missoula, Montana, going up to the pass. I don't know whether there's a Lolo Pass or which one, on into the state of Washington, but the dust was a foot thick. And I remember we damn near choked to death in the car because you had to keep the window shut. There was just absolutely clouds and clouds of dust. And we did make it through. Also, we got out to the Umatilla area in Washington and had to take a ferry, which no longer exists out there. They've got a bridge in now. And one of the advertising signs that you'd see along the road was for chicken dinner. And chicken dinner was a candy bar, which I've never seen since that time period. Along the Columbia Gorge, the point that always brought the trip to mind was Crown Point, which was an elevation clear up that you drove up to, and then you could look down and see a great expanse of the Columbia River Valley. The grandparents lived in a very small house. It was a maximum of 2 small bedrooms there in Roseburg. Besides the house, though, they had quite an expanse of orchard. And in that orchard, Granddad had at least 2 of every kind of fruit tree you could think of. And I remember some of the odd ones, such as fig trees. And there's nothing like a ripe fig. And gooseberries the size of large marbles. That still I've never seen anything equal to it. But he had peaches and apples and pears and cherries, and I can't remember all the rest. Besides the fruit orchard, he had goats because he supplied milk on contract to the local hospital, goat's milk, for the people that were allergic to cow's milk. So he had a small herd of goats that he worked with there as well. And then he also raised chickens. And one experience that I think Gordon and I both had was when Granddad was killing some chickens to clean them and sell them. And this was done under the house, and we were hiding, and he didn't know we were there. And I've often wondered if Granddad was part Jewish, because he actually prayed over these chickens as he was executing them and bleeding them.
Another thing about the orchard up on the hillside by the house there, they had a terrible problem there with moles digging up through that whole orchard area, and so Grandpa had his own little way of taking care of them. He had a little device that he put down in the ground in the direction that he could see that the moles were going, or the mole, and it had a shotgun shell in it. And the mole would come up and hit the trigger, and bang, there goes the mole. And those things, you'd hear the blast go off night and day. And I've thought many times over the years that was sort of a dangerous thing for us to be playing up there in that doggone orchard with a shotgun shell, that we could have accidentally triggered the darn thing if we knew where it was. Or anyway, that's one thing that's stuck in my mind over the years. In the fig trees, there was a family right across the road. Now this house was not right in the city of or the town of Roseburg. It was outside of town a ways, and their house was at the end of a dead end lane. In the summertime, it got awfully dry out there, and I remember the ground would crack. There'd be cracks, an inch wide all over the doggone area out there due to lack of rain. But the people that lived across the road had several of these fig trees, and they were delicious figs in the late summer. And the young fellow, the boy that lived there was Bruce Bernard Blevins. I've always remembered that name because it's BBB initials, and I thought, God, that was great having initials like that. Bruce Bernard Blevins. But we played with him quite a bit then while we were out there. we did a lot of walking down to a store that was right down at the entrance to this dead-end road. And I remember Grandpa would always give us a nickel for a popsicle. And we'd walk down and buy a popsicle and walk back or whatever. The products that were raised there in that little farm community got taken into town by foot. And remember, Grandma would have a big basket with some eggs and gosh, I guess she took the jars of milk in, and but toddling along, bow-legged as she was, all the way in, and took most of the day to get in and back out again. But she was at it day after day. One thing that Galen mentioned was were the goats that Grandpa had that were milked. And I tell you, once you've been around a goat, the smell of a goat you remember forever and ever. And when I just think about them, I can still smell those goats out there. Another thing they had a problem with, of some sort, was a little bug called an earwig. And every night, Grandpa would take a newspaper and crumple it up and stick it out there in bushes, several pages of the newspaper. And these earwigs would find their way into the newspaper overnight, and every morning he'd burn the newspapers to get rid of these earwigs. Now, it was never too clear in my mind what the worry was about these earwigs, whether they actually got in your ear or what, but he was after them every evening with his papers.
One of the problems that they had out there when we were there was a very dry summer, and the pasture where Granddad kept his goats caught on fire. And I don't know whether Gordon and I got involved in trying to fight the fire or not. I suspect we may have had a broom or something and tried to beat it back down, but eventually it was put out. But it was a pretty good sized section of land, an acre or so, that got burned out. One of the other things I recall is that we must have been there for a couple of weeks anyway. I don't know how Dad had all the time off at that time, but Gordon and I built a little wagon. There was a round log, and we cut it crossways to make wheels for this wagon. And the only time I remember using it, we got up at the top of the hill in the orchard and started down in it, and I think the wheels all came off, and that was the end of it. It didn't last very long, but it was indicative we were always building something for entertainment or just for the heck of it. As far as we can tell on this same trip, and it was either before we got to Roseburg or on our return back to Montana, we were in a tourist cabin overnight. One of these where you had to supply your own linen. And for some reason, I was doing something with a razor blade, whether it was working with a model airplane or a model boat or something of that nature. And I dropped the razor blade, and it stuck in the table. And I put my elbow right on top of it. And Dad was standing right nearby, and he saw exactly what was going to happen, so he came right over and shut off the bleeding. But it put at least a quarter-inch long cut in my elbow, and I still have the scar for it today. It just reminded me how small a Model A was. It was a two-door, and it may have had an outside trunk on it, it may not. I think it possibly did. But anyway, because it was so small, we had our own zones in the car, and God help anybody that put a hand over their zone into somebody else's space. we had a few spats over just exactly that sort of thing. Also, this may or may not have been the trip when Gordon drank an lemon soda, and it was shortly after drinking it that it was spewed up all over the inside of the car, even though he tried to get it outside.
Yep.
Agate Beach was
On the way home, Dad always drove over to the coast of Oregon, and there's lots of sandy beaches, not very long ones, but quite a number. Remember, we'd always go down and look for moon rocks, these agates that were down in the sand. We always bring home buckets full of them, I believe, and there may still be some there at the old house in Great Falls, out in the yard somewhere. But we enjoyed those beaches along the coast of Oregon. And to this day, when I'm out there, we still drop down and take a look at some of those old beaches.
Gordon had mentioned these moon rocks, which I just thought were natural ocean agates, and basically they are a type of agate. But in this particular, anyway, we had a little brief interlude there. And it was either on this trip or possibly a later one, but I think it was this one where we found a strata of these agates up above the beach. And I mean, these things were up to as big as 2 inches long in some cases. And we took fruit jars full of them home. And again, I have no idea where any of them are. To complete this little dissertation on the Lindner family, going back to an earlier time period when they still lived in Hayward, Wisconsin before moving to Roseburg, back during World War I, Dad went into the Army, and he did a tour of duty up in Siberia and back. In fact, he was with the American Expeditionary Forces in Russia, of which there were 35,000, and very few people know they were there. They were up there to eradicate the Bolsheviks. Unfortunately, they lost, and the Bolsheviks won. This was at the very end of World War I. Also, his older brother, Walter, was in the Army in France and died in France just the month the armistice was signed. They also had a sister, Rose, who died at the age of 21, and from all indications and conversations that we've had, and with Mary Jane White Lindner, who's Gordon's wife, who lived in Great Falls and met Lena after Granddad had died, recalled that Lena had mentioned that her daughter Rose was very, very ill and never really recovered from it, and we're wondering if maybe Rose didn't die from the influenza that hit in 1918 and killed so many people worldwide. I had heard that she died of tuberculosis, but that could be just what the flu was called, or somebody picked it up on that basis. And Mary Jane told me something today that really surprised me, and that is that Rose's hair was red, or reddish tinted. And I have one picture of Rose, and it's a black and white, so you really can't tell. And it makes sense, because it could very easily be the reason that Grandmother Lindner named her only daughter Rose. Our grandfather Lindner died in January of 1942. I was in high school, Gordon was in college, and Dad went out and took care of the situation in Roseburg. Granddad was a German Lutheran by religion, So the Lutheran service was held for him, and my dad was madder than hell because he said all that preacher did was preach hell and damnation, and the old man didn't have a bad bone in his body, and he really resented the way the preacher was carrying on. Granddad is buried in the Masonic Cemetery in Roseburg, Oregon. When Dad came back, he brought grandmother back to live with us in Great Falls, and she lived with us from 1942 until sometime in 1946, because she was apparently not there when Gordon and I came back out of the service, which was in the spring of '46. Mary Jane said that our Uncle George and Aunt Nina had come back to Great Falls to pick grandmother up and take her back to Minnesota to live with them. And she died, I believe, just about a year later, I think in 1947. I don't have a real good fix on that. It seems that in our conversation, putting all this on tape, we've unearthed the possibility that we lost one trip out to Roseburg. We have found some pictures that obviously put Gordon and I in an age group of 8 or 9 and 10, which would put it in 1933. And I think this was the trip in the Ford when I remember going through a section of muddy road going in towards Helena that I didn't think Dad was going to be able to get through. So we actually had 3 trips out there, it seems. One approximately 1933, one in 1935, and then one in 1937, which is the one we made when June came out from Hayward and joined us, and we all went out on a tour of the states of Washington and Oregon. On that trip, I remember June and Mom wearing shorts, which was very risque for people of that particular time span. And Gordon and I and Dad, I think, at times were a little embarrassed about their wear. We spent some time on the beach, and on a beach in Oregon. I think we tried to find the old agate beach, and I think we did find it, but somebody had pretty well mined out all the agates that we had found up on the cliffside that one last time we were out. On this particular trip, we also went down to Crescent City, California, where we saw the big redwoods, and of course we stopped to visit the grandparents there in Roseburg. Gordon just reminded me that on that trip we had passed June off as our older sister because we had always wanted to have a sister to complete our family group, but that was not to be, so we kind of used June as a surrogate. It worked out pretty good.
Going back to the Grandma and Grandpa's house there in Roseburg, one of the things I remember was that it was a typical farmyard condition where there were lots of flies around, and the screen doors in the house didn't fit too good, so the house always had flies inside. And Grandpa would pay us 1 penny for every 10 flies that we swatted and killed inside the house. And as I remember, that's the way we got our nickel from him to go get the popsicles.
When we were out there in 1937, this is when Hitler was really starting to cause problems in Europe, and Granddad would sit by his radio at a certain hour every day to listen to the news. And of course he had come from Germany. He still had relatives in Germany, and he was really agitated over what was happening there in his old home country. So it was just a case of Granddad listening and getting upset, and he wasn't a drinking man, or I think he would have, but he would then calm down after a while and things would be normal again. One last little point, because we're trying to use up some of this remaining tape, and that is the weather. It was always warm to hot, and at no time do I remember any time that we were out there that there was any rain or nasty weather of that type whatsoever.